Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, and welcome to the first episode of the Ranger Reject Go-Go Loser Ranger, or Sentai Daishikaku episode reviews. I am super happy to bring this series to you all, as today is the release date of the first episode of, as what I'm going to call the Ranger Reject anime. That is one of the two non-official names, but the name that I think personally works best for a series. As number one, it is not the original name, which is in Japanese, and for me is just very hard to say for some reason, or the not as good Kodansha English translation of Go-Go Loser Ranger. I do think it's got a fun spin to it, but I do like the title of Ranger Reject. It's just got a much better flow, and for the standard of the series, I think it does work a lot better. But as I said, today is the release date of the first episode of the anime. I have been waiting for this anime for a really long time, ever since I initially picked up the first English tankobon of the manga. I think it was like August of 2022. And since then, I have caught up on the entire series, and I really love this series. While I don't think it starts out the strongest, I think there's a lot of good to be had in this series. And even if it does take a little bit of time, I am very much excited to see where this anime goes, and hopefully it brings in a larger new audience to this series, because it is too good not to at a point, right? But in case you don't know what this series is about, it is written by the author Negi Haruba. They are the author of the Quintessential Quintuplets, which was a romance harem manga, but this series is actually a action-based Super Sentai series. Super Sentai being the old Power Rangers, like, hey, there are 5, as they are called in this series, Dragon Keepers fighting an enemy, with a little bit of a twist in there that we'll get to about halfway through the episode and review here that I'll be going through. The anime here is produced by Yoestar Pictures. I couldn't tell you anything else that Yoestar Pictures does, but they are the people who are doing it. This episode is titled "We Are Justice!" The Divine, or the Dragon Keepers. I wrote Divine because that's what I'm always used to calling them, the Divine Dragon Keepers, but no, it is just "We Are Justice!" The Dragon Keepers, and that is the episode title. And this episode covers almost everything wrapped up in chapter 1 of the manga. There is one big, I would say glaring scene, but it's literally like 2 panels, which is just a character saying, oh, where did this person go? Oh, they're not there. And that is the only big, notable exception that I saw was changed for the original manga. But this episode does cover pretty much everything in chapter 1, though it does reorder it a little bit, which I think does work in the anime's case here, but I will get to that whenever we get to it. But without further ado, I'm just really excited to talk about Ranger Reject, and yeah, like I said, I will be calling it by Ranger Reject here, for most of these reviews, unless something happens and the videos just aren't performing well while I call them Ranger Reject, but it just flows off the tongue a lot better, and I think it's a better name for the series, right? But let's go and hop right into it. So this episode sort of starts off in an interesting way, as we get our main, like, plot device for the series. And we learn in this town that we do not get a full name of at this point, and if we did, I forgot to write it down. Very, very plausible that's what happened. But we get the logo of the series, and as it sort of fades out, we see that 13 years ago, a sky fortress started floating above this town at 10,000 meters, starting a never-ending war in this city. And at this point, as we see a bunch of the, like, establishing shots of people walking throughout the city, we hear murmurings of something called a Sunday Showdown occurring soon, as we sort of also get the Keeper introduction at this point. The Keepers are, of course, the Divine Dragon Keepers, as they're called. There's the Red Keeper, the Blue Keeper, the Green Keeper, the Yellow Keeper, and the Pink Keeper. All of them are sort of showing off cool action moves, fighting, as we'll learn later, these people called Fighters or Dusters. We'll learn more about them later. But as we get an introduction to all of these Keepers, it is a really cool action scene where they're just going, like, back and forth and just like pow, 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 kick, slice, whoo, just a bunch of cool action stuff. And eventually, we learn about this Sunday Showdown. And pretty much we learn that every Sunday, there's one of these Sunday Showdowns, where the monsters come from the big fortress up high down to the down to a stadium where they fight the divine dragon keepers in their entirety. We see that the red keeper is going around and has gotten to the event early and is signing a bunch of people's things and like, hey, I'll keep you all safe, nothing to worry about here. And we pretty much see this red keeper seems to be a really good person who is ready to help all these people from these dangerous monsters attacking from the sky. At this point, we change to a different scene inside of a train station where there are two rangers sort of standing around, one in a white uniform and one in a yellow uniform. The yellow uniform is a female and the white uniform is a guy. And they come up to a black-haired kid who is sort of just standing around, right? And the black-haired kid is like, oh, you two are rangers, huh? And as they're all talking through all of this, these two rangers just like, oh, how are you doing? This is the city where the divine dragon keepers keep everyone safe, but don't go out into the city for fear of monster attacks because, oh man, that sky fortress up in the sky, ah man, those monsters, but hey, we got the dragon keepers and we're keepers too, right? They're like, but it is dangerous out there, so be wary. And this kid's just like, but there hasn't been a casualty from these monsters in a long time, hasn't there? And the yellow ranger here just says like, oh, well, I won't quite say that. That's just what we say to keep up our faces, right? Showing that maybe there's a bit more than meets the eye here. But eventually the person in the white uniform, they seem very like over dramatic, like, oh, hey, how are you doing? Like very energetic. They hand a flyer over to this kid and they say, hey, you should join the Dragon Rangers, right? It is actually very easy to join, and we could very much use your help. That's pretty much what they get across here, right? And eventually, they hand the kid this flyer, and the kid's just like, oh, Dragon Rangers. I don't know if I want to become one, though. As eventually, the female goes up to him and grabs his hand, and she's just like, oh, well, the rest is actually up to you. And she's like, well, I guess that much. As she sort of like seductively grabs this kid's hand and starts to pull away, as eventually we cut to another scene where a few minutes later, as this kid is fully walking into the city, and we see the flying fortress above the city as a whole, right? And we sort of just see the magnitude that this is sort of bring as these chains are like binding the city down to the ground. Well, as all of this happens, we get some more establishing shots of the city, as eventually we see just a little girl looking up to the fortress in the sky, as all of a sudden, something comes crashing down from the fortress in the sky into the middle of the arena, as we suddenly see that, as we get a little bit of an explanation, that these are fighters and dusters who are coming down from this alien sort of spaceship, along with a boss monster of Old Tora Tiger, right? So, pretty much as we see all of this, we see that these are the enemies that these Dragon Rangers will be facing off in this Sunday showdown. As we see that they are all just standing there in a circle, like getting ready to do their whole world domination speech, and they are going to win this time against the Dragon Keepers. As a bunch of people in the audience are like throwing cans towards them, like hitting them all, and like a bunch of these fighters are like, ah man, stop hitting us, right? And we even see this big tiger boss creature. He's getting like hit in the head by these cans and sort of just like shrugs it off in a way. As all of a sudden, the Divine Dragon Keepers arrive, as we see all 5 of them sort of just walk into the stadium, do a massive interest, and the crowd just roars, and they're just like, the Dragon Keepers are here, like, you can beat them, like, don't get into despair, like, you guys can do it, right? As all of a sudden, this boss tiger monster that we learned is Old Tora Tiger, I'm just going to call him Tora, because that's easier, they start to speak up, and they're just like, oh, what are you lowly humans doing today? And he's just like, I am Old Tora Tiger. I am born from the hatred of all of the various tigers that you people have enslaved. And he's just like, and now we will attack. As all of a sudden, everybody just starts to go and attack. The Dragon Keepers start to parry off all of these small fighters running around. and the tiger creature is wreaking havoc in the battlefield. We cut over to where a certain fighter is sort of just running around. Most of these fighters do have patches on their arms corresponding to letters of the alphabet, as we see that fighter A is running towards the crowd and it seems to get ready to cut down a little girl, but all of a sudden the yellow jumpsuited girl that we saw before, whose name we learn here in a second is Sukuri, suddenly jumps out and parries the attack of this fighter A. And Fighter A sort of like stumbles back and all of a sudden just like, oh, how dare you do this, as Sakuri calls over to the other person whose name is Sakurama, and she's like, hey Sakurama, get all of these civilians out of here, we don't want any casualties at all, right? Which is a little bit interesting due to like the casualty note that we made earlier, but whatever. So Sakuri here sort of starts to fend off this fighter, and eventually he's just like, oh man, right? As we see a bunch of the audience members are looking down to this, as they're just like, oh man, these people have strong attacks. Like, these may be the strongest enemies that the Dragon Rangers have like ever faced, and we've been doing this for years. Like, this is insane. Like, they're so powerful, right? As all of a sudden we see that the Tora Tiger person suddenly like grabs his fist, punches him into the ground, makes a huge cloud of smoke as smoke is rising up from the battlefield and everything. We see the Green Ranger eventually go down and pick up a rock with superhuman strength and throw it at the tiger. We see that everybody's like, oh man, did they win? But no, as Tora Tiger sort of just steps back up and like they survive, as they then do a move called the Tora Transform, as they transform then into a car and run over all of the various divine Dragon Rangers, right? And all of the fans like start to fall into despair. So like, oh man, what are we gonna do? We can't survive like this. Like, we're just getting overwhelmed. Like, we're just gonna die. Like, they're really like freaking out. Like, is this the end of the Dragon Rangers? Is this really it? As all of a sudden, all the people get very run over, right? As all of a sudden, all of the Rangers stand up, right? And they do the typical, like, Shonen speech of, we will always stand up no matter how far we get beaten down. And the crowd just cheers wildly, as all of a sudden, they start to get into, like, a Kamehameha position, or that's at least what the Red Ranger does, as all of the fighters suddenly jump around to where the Tora Tiger creature is, right? And at this point, they all start to talk to one another, as we sort of understand that something isn't quite right here, as one of the dusters just says like, or dusters or fighters, one of the fighters just says like, oh man, they're using their divine artifact like already? Like, this seems like really early in the episode, right? And they specifically do call it an episode, as all of a sudden, all of them gather together again, and A says to the big Tor Tiger, just like, hey, or we're just going to do classic after they hit us with the Dragon Blaster. We'll just go back up to the fortress and wait till next week. Like, there's not really too much to say, as all of a sudden we see that Fighter D is here. We'll get more into Fighter D, but Fighter D speaks up, and it's just like, hey, you prepped a losing speech, right? And, they're all just like, well, and Tor Tiger's like, oh man, I totally forgot to, as, D's just like, well, hey, just say something simple like, I'll remember this, like, we'll get you next time, just something that they'll always remember, right? As everybody's like, come on, D, that's just, like, too cliche, like, we can't say that. As all of a sudden, they all realize, like, D, wait, why are you here? You weren't supposed to be on shift today, right? And you're like, shift? Why are these, attackers on a shift? As all of a sudden, we see that all of the Dragon Keepers have finally charged up their attack, and they unleash a Dragon Breath onto all of these various fighters. As all of a sudden, we see that Fighter D just starts to walk up into the crowd, or towards the Dragon Creepers, as this massive blast is coming towards them, right? And all of a sudden, they're all just like, oh no, we're all done, as there's a massive explosion. And we see that almost all of the fighters are gone, except for one, that is Fighter D, who is still standing there as the Red Keeper says something about going to commercial breaks. And that is where we sort of cut the dude a bit first big scene cut of the series, as we go the 1 hour earlier, inside of the flying fortress above the sky, where we see all these fighters are up there, and they are working on the monster of the week, right? As they are debating what this week's monster of the week is going to be, as we pretty much get the whole crux of this series, is that 13 years ago, all of these fighters and alien creatures appeared on this planet, but in just 1 year, all of their bosses were defeated by the Dragon Keepers, and that they are performing an act to the people down below as fighters and monsters, because they are no longer a threat, but they are pretty much being perceived as a threat by the people down below, and the Dragon Keepers want them to continue to put on a show, and that's why we saw like the Red Keeper talk about commercials and everything, and we pretty much see all of the fighters are coming up with this week's big bad boss monster, which eventually is the Tora truck thing. We see that Fighter G is there, and Fighter G is like, man, we should do like a big buff thing. Fighter A is over in the corner, pretty much says like, hey, it's not a bad idea, but we need a motif at this point. We've run through all of the basic ideas too many times. As all of a sudden we see that Fighter L, who is a female, appears. As a manga reader, I didn't realize that any of these fighters were female, but it does make sense that like Fighter L, Fighter Love in a way, female, makes perfect sense. As we see that some of these fighters have letters that correspond to different attributes of themselves. Fighter L talked about like, oh hey, we can make like a cute little cat thing, right? As eventually somebody's like, well, we can make it like a lion or something. But somebody else just says like, oh man, we made a lion 7 years ago, no point in doing it again. Like, they don't want repeats down there, else the Dragon Rangers are really gonna be upset, right? As eventually they're all just like, oh man, we're just so out of all of these ideas, like we just have nothing left in the tank at all. As all of a sudden we cut over to somebody sitting over in the corner, and we see that this is Fighter D, the one who is down on the ground, who sort of seemed like they had something else going on, right? As they say something about like, hey, well, instead of a lion, why don't we do a tiger? We haven't done one of those yet, and apparently dragons and tigers in old Japanese mythology were always trying to fight with each other, right? And we see this as Fighter D, and we get their name appearing on screen, sort of showing that, yes, Fighter D is a little bit of an important character in this series, may or may not be our main character. Oh, look at that. And some text appears on screen, and Fighter D sort of just does like a full fourth wall break, just like pushing it out of the way. Pretty much showing that like, okay, something's going on here, right? And like, yeah, these guys are a little bit comedic. And as we'll get into it, all of these fighters are acting very comedically, like, they're very much as comic relief, going towards their nature of, yeah, they're not a threat at all. They're almost like a comic relief at a point, right? And at this point, Fighter D sort of just starts talking. He's just like, man, I mean, we just want to win, and they're just like, we will have a goal of world domination. That's what our bosses and forefathers from long ago set for us, and like, even though they're defeated, we can still work towards winning all of these times. As we see a bunch of the other fighters are just laughing at him like, hey, we gave up on that dream a long time ago. Like, there's not really anything left to do about it. And everybody just ridicules Fighter D, and they all start to walk away. Fighter D is sort of just sitting on the ground as another fighter, Fighter F, appears, and we see that Fighter F's whole thing is F for fat, as Fighter F is a little rotund, all things considered, but Fighter F is just like, hey, we fought the Divine Dragon Rangers nearly 1,000 times at this point, and we haven't won a single one. It is just our goal to be pawns in this whole system. As D sort of just speaks to him, like, hey, it's been 998 times, not at 1,000 yet, like, we're not there yet, we can still win at least one of these 1,000, right? As, pretty much F's just like, hey, we all really just lost this battle today, that all of the bosses were killed so long ago, and, there's like, hey, we just have to act. That was the conditions of the truce. They wouldn't kill us as long as we played the part and made them out to be something bigger than they really were, right? We sort of at this point get over to another cut inside of the place where we see that Fighter Z is trying to turn into a tiger, and they sort of relate to like, oh, tiger, oh, well, the Japanese word for tiger is Tora. And oh man, Tora sort of sounds like trucks, like Taiga Tora truck. Oh man, that's why the Tora turned into a truck. Look at that, it's a little bit of a funny joke. But they're all just talking about this as Fighter F and Fighter D sort of just continue to talk, right? And Fighter F is eventually just like, hey, D, back on the ground a few weeks ago, there was a kid who was on the field, right? And I was going right to attack him, and as one of the Rangers came to stop me, the kid cheered me on and told me to do my best. And Fighter F's just like, it actually felt really good to feel that. To feel somebody want us to win eventually. And eventually he just says, hey, we as fighters are meant to do the job of losers. And I want to be the best loser I can be in this scenario. Even if we are forced to act by these people up above, I want to show that I have something more and something different that these people don't have. So we're just only like, hey, even if we are meant to lose, I'm going to do my best and put on a performance because I felt good wanting to do my best. And he's just like, and we can't win, we know that, so I'm going to do what I can. And it's a very interesting thing as we suddenly cut over back to the present, where D just got hit by the massive blast and is currently reforming himself. We learned that all of the fighters are immortal at this point, and we also saw from earlier when Fighter Z was transforming into the tiger thing, they can also transform into different appearances. Maybe that won't come in interesting later, we'll see. As eventually D's just very angry and is walking out towards all of the keepers, just like, hey, let us win one, you guys have won so many so far, don't you just want to change? It is so static, like, let us win at least once. Right, as he starts to give this big speech to the Dragon Keepers, as it starts to look really cool as he sort of starts to run up. He has a little bit of a knife arm as he transforms his arm into a knife sort of blade looking thing, and starts to run up to these guys and like jumps up into the air and like zips around towards them. But in reality, we see that he's actually just sort of pathetically running towards the Dragon Keepers, as the Dragon Keepers are all just like, oh man, we left one alive, oops. Well, what do we do about this? And it's like, oh, hey, Red Keeper, you go deal with it, as we sort of get the idea that the Red Keeper is the de facto leader of all of these troops. The Red Keeper sort of runs up to the Fighter D, who is running towards with his knife arm, and as Fighter D is running up, somebody in the crowd, another young boy, is standing there and yells to Fighter D for him to do his best, right? And Fighter D sort of just goes on an internal monologue of just like being angry at the world and angry at these Dragon Keepers who have prosecuted them for so long, and angry at the humans who actually don't want to see the fighters win. All they want to see actually is just them do their thing and to actually lose. So they're like a false sense of security and cheering there. D sort of has a point, but it's sort of something to mull over in the end. As eventually the Red Keeper runs up to where Fighter D is, and Red sort of just like puts a hand on D's shoulder and she's like, hey, you guys did a good job today, but you really need to know your place. And he's just like, hey, just read the room around you. You are always meant to lose, we are meant to win. As eventually he just like yells out like, we are justice! And slices the Fighter D in half with his blade. And that is where the title of the episode comes from, the We Are Justice, as that is like Red's big thing, is like, we are justice, we will win the final battle, as he sort of just shows off his thing. As all of a sudden, we cut back up to the fortress up above, where Fighter F is just talking for all the other Rangers. They're just like, hey, Fighter Z got knocked out a little bit, but he'll be fine later. He's just going to have to take some extra time to regenerate after being in that form for so long. And Fighter F makes a note of like, hey, this was the 999th battle we have fought, and the 999th battle that we have indeed lost. As eventually they're all just like, oh wait, hey, where's Fighter D? And they're just like, oh, well, I guess he's just not back yet, because they all saw him run forward during that time. as all of a sudden we see that D is reforming on top of a building inside the town, as all of his body parts are reconglomerating back together, sort of just like forming his face again, being that he is immortal. And all of a sudden, we see that he starts to also take on a different form. The form of the black-haired kid that we saw earlier, interacting with Sakurama and Sukuri, those two rangers. As all of a sudden, we see Sukuri appear, as she runs up onto the top of this building, and she's like, "Oh, hey, there you are, kid." And she's like, "Well, how was the, Sunday Showdown? Did you enjoy it?" And, we see a D in this other form, just like, "Yeah, no, I actually did really enjoy it." And he's standing on top of the building, he's like, "Yeah, I had a really good vantage point from up here," and Sukuri's just like, "Okay, then." And eventually, D turns around to Sakura and is like, "Hey, can I still join the Divine Dragon Rangers?" And she's just like, why do you want to join now? Like, I thought you were so against it earlier." But D is just like, "No, I want to join now," as he turns over to a billboard, which has all of the 5 Dragon Keepers on it in their various poses, as he's just like, "No, I want to join it. And I want to take down all of our enemies." As whenever he says it, he obviously means he wants to take down the Dragon Keepers, but to the unsuspected, he wants to take down the fighters. As we see it, the whole premise of this series is that Fighter D, a lowly foot soldier in the infantry army, of the invader army, is coming down to the surface to infiltrate the Dragon Keepers to try to do some good in this world. And that is where we end the episode, and that is where we end chapter 1 of the manga at the same time. So, the differences in how the episodes are paced here is that in chapter 1, it is a very clear-cut thing of like, alright, we get introduced to the black-haired kid, Sakurama and Suzuki. We cut up to the fortress up above, introduced to the whole fighter thing and all of the whole like reveal of like, oh hey, we are being enslaved by these people to put on a show, to then them crashing down, doing the whole battle, and there's no divide in the episode. It's sort of just like a continual flow between the whole thing, while here we sort of just have like, alright, here's the battle, Fighter D has the moment of like, oh hey, here's the flashback, and then we have it. I do think it works here, I'm not complaining at all, it's just a different way to put it. But now we get to the ending of the episode, but here we get our first listen at the opening theme of the series. The opening is called Jikai Yokuko by Tatsuya Kitani. Tatsuya Kitani is, of course, a massive opening artist right now. I mean, he's done Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, he did Bleach, he's done so many things recently, so many massive shows, all things considered. As something really cool about this ending sequence we see here is not only the credits rolling down one side, the left side of the screen, but on the right side of the screen, we actually get to see some of the frames and animation keys, sort of see how it all got put together into this episode. It's a really cool ending off note, sort of seeing like, oh hey, this is how this episode was made, this is how that cool fight scene with Fighter D was made. It's really cool to see. And we learn the name of the next episode as we sort of get our little end sequence of 2 knit dolls talking, one of Fighter D in the fighter form and one of Sukuri in her form, sort of just both talking. We get the name of the next episode is Go Fighter D. And that's where we end off this episode in its entirety. One big thing I think I need to mention is that most of the Rangers look to be 3D CG most of the time. There are definitely some shots where it is 2D animation, but most of it does seem to be 3D, so if you're not really a fan of 3D, it's not really that noticeable, but it is definitely noticeable to the naked eye when you're like, oh, hey, I can tell that all of that's 2D, but this is 3D a little bit. It's not that big of a deal, but as the 3D animation doesn't look bad at all, but it definitely is 3D, so be ready for that if you haven't watched this episode yet. And definitely the fighters are all meant to be like a comedy aspect when the series isn't really a comedy. With that, I didn't really do a whole good job breaking down this episode. I'll promise I'll try to be better next time. Yeah, I just want to talk about the series. I'll do it a lot better next time, like I said. I've just sort of been off my game here right now. I haven't recorded a video in like 2 weeks. I just haven't had time. But yeah, with that, thank you guys all for watching. This was Ranger Reject Episode 1, titled We Are Justice, the Divine Dragon Keepers. I'll be back next time, or next week, or next Sunday for Episode 2, titled, of course, Go Fighter D. And yeah, with that, thank you guys for watching so very much. If you liked it, there's all those things YouTubers ask you to do. It would be very nice if you did most of them. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. This is Glowplasma231, signing out.